Welcome to show 98 or episode 98, authentic project-based learning in science using urban farms and Tyre gardens as mind tools. Mind tools reminds me of David Jonason's work. Get that book if you have a chance. You'll be happy you did. Or Seymour Papert's work. Today we have with us guests who frequented the grounds of Indiana University a few years back as Fulbright scholars. So they both are Fulbright scholars and award-winning teachers. They're both from New Zealand, one from the North Island, one from the South Island. We're bringing them together today. Both science teachers. Both of them are interested in problem-based learning and inquiry, and they're going to talk about what they've done in terms of problem-based learning and inquiry. In particular, they're interested in student motivation and growth. Growth of plants and crops and farms, but growth of minds. Simon's interested in metacognition. He'll talk about Feuerstein's work, I assume, in the next hour on metacognition. And Sutapa's interested in alternative ways of assessing students and their learnings, and now has moved on. I think she's at some kind of national assessment center in New Zealand. She'll talk to us about that. National assessment facilitator in New Zealand. They are both experienced and experimental teachers. And they've both written a chapter in my new book on, what's it called? Transformative Teaching Around the World. So if you want that chapter, just send me a note and I'm happy to send you them. But most importantly, they took my R546 course on thinking, motivation, and collaboration a few years ago, like about 40 or 50 other Fulbright teachers did. And we're a community. We all kind of really love each other. And that's why we did the book together. And they haven't even gotten their copies yet, I assume. So I will enlighten them with, oh, you bought a copy. That's right, you did get one. So they've got a lot in common, yet I don't know whether they've ever met. So this is our way of bringing the two of them together in one show in 1 hour. And I think we'll go with the ladies first, since the only time I've seen Sutapa in 6 years or 7 years has been her wedding a couple of months ago when I came in Zoom and watched her wedding. So Sutapa, would you like to tell us what you're up to, what you have been doing, what your chapter is about in terms of getting kids inspired through project and problem-based learning?
Kia ora, everybody. The word kia ora means hello in Māori in New Zealand. Thank you, Kurt, and the rest of the team for having me here. And I will sort of briefly tell you about my past life, which has been 3 decades plus, where I've been teaching science in various countries. So it started in India, moved to the Middle East for 11 years, taught in New Zealand for several years, landed up in the USA, and did this Fulbright course where I learned a lot from classes, from other colleagues. And those were ideas that I brought back and continued with several project-based learning situations in my classroom. So I'll give you a snapshot of what exactly I did. So at school, I was one of those students who got bored very easily. As a result, as a teacher, I tried to make sure that the kids were engaged all the time in my classes, whether it was me dancing as a bumblebee to explain the bees finding courses to the flowers, or basically teaching about plants and what a boring chapter it is when you have to talk about flowers, roots, stems. And that was when I decided, why not tackle it through, first of all, an inquiry-based learning idea, proceed more towards a problem-based learning, and then move on to, depending on how the kids took onto it, a project-based learning unit. So it all started off with showing the students pictures of Singapore, New York, Mumbai, the most crowded places in the world with the highest rents possible, or ownership in terms of houses. And the kids couldn't understand why they were doing this in a science class. And then what they did was they had to find out the cost of houses in central Auckland, which is probably one of the highest these days, moving out of Auckland and then further out. And then the next question was, how much would you pay for a house? And the thing was, we wouldn't be able to buy a house. And we then looked at the possibility of vertical living, because New Zealand doesn't have too much of vertical living like Hong Kong, Singapore, New York, etc. And then the idea was, well, if you've got a house in one of these far away from the city where you don't have access to run down the road and buy your stuff at a supermarket, how are you going to grow basic things like herbs? How are you going to grow crops if it's possible? How are you going to have flowers? And so the kids came up with all the ideas. The whole idea was floated to them. They came out with the ideas, and those ideas then turned into a big, large-scale project where we approached companies around the school, and we had paint brought in, we had tires brought in. So it all started with pallets. We had vertical gardens, and then we had tire gardens where the students started painting these tires, made them look beautiful, and right in pop in the middle of the school, we had this beautiful tire garden with all the flowers. And then I managed to get some funding, and it moved on to a hydroponics garden. But the amount of learning that happened personally to me was amazing. We're going back about 8 years where drones were just coming in. But the whole idea of learning about drones came about from a student in my classroom who basically said, because one of the tasks was a digital task where students had to stitch together 6 of their projects, but produce only one single static image of what they had learned. And this child brought his drone to the class, a big, massive sports car. And I said, well, what are you doing? He hijacked my whole class. Because what happened was at the click of a button, the 4 doors opened out, cameras were under these doors. And he showed us how he could take pictures from various angles, stitch them together, and produce it as an image of an insect eye with a mosaic. Now, you tell me, at the age of 13, if the kid is going to do this, he's going to just do wonders when he grows older, because that was something I couldn't believe it. And this is a kid who never would do his homework on paper. He would never submit his work. And yet he excelled beyond the classroom. And so I think the whole idea, what made me realize was I need to go UDL in a larger scale. And from there, it was a whole lot of other things that I did with the kids, because at the end of it, we actually had a hydroponics unit established at school, and kids were sort of talking about selling their products, making a little bit of pocket money, but the pride and joy with hands-on learning, solving a problem as to how in the future you can do this, was demonstrated not by me, but ideas that came from the children. So that was one of my projects. And that is chapter 30 in your book, Kurt.
I think you also had a young girl, maybe, or a young boy who was.
Oh, yes.
You want to explain what happened about that before we go on to Simon?
That was amazing. Now, this was a young girl whose mother came into school and said to me, what kind of homework are you giving my child, who's a science student, not doing any science work, but is using digital technology and hours together? And I said, well, that is science work. And she said, what do you mean? She's doing one image and she's got all these things and she's tinkering around. And I said, well, what this young girl did was, one of her projects was a self-watering unit as to how a plant could grow without you having to look after it. And the plant that she had used was the bean plant. And she made multiple copies of the bean plant and blew them out of size, shrunk herself almost like the movie Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And her whole idea was the future of biotechnology, because they had researched about biotechnology, genetic manipulation. And so the idea was bean plants that are going to be larger than life, and they're going to give us much more protein compared to the normal beans that we are growing. Now, for a child to think on those terms, biotech going to that extent was again mind-blowing. And this whole project was then presented to the staff, about 93 staff members, just with the students, where I wasn't involved in any part of the presentation except introducing them. So it built a lot of confidence, because overnight, the kids' Tyre garden became the selfie garden at school.
Didn't she win an award for it?
This is not the kid who won the award.
Okay.
They won awards at school, but there were a whole lot of other projects that I have done where students have actually gone on to featuring on the cover page as well as the inside pages of the Education Gazette that is published in New Zealand. So I've had about 5 publications of student work in these in the National Gazette.
Well, that's a great transition to Simon, because Simon recently was featured in the National Encourager in New Zealand about his urban concept farm. And so maybe there he is. In fact, maybe Simon could tell us a little bit about the article and about the urban concept farm and what he's been up to. Simon, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. Thanks very much for having me, everyone. So just as a brief bit of a summary, I started off life as a geologist and left there to become a teacher. And I've been 24 years in teaching, just finished at the end of last year as a head of science and a teacher at my school. So I'm now volunteering.
And a PhD in geology, I believe,
yeah, PhD,
right?
Yeah,
and
PhD in geology.
And a Paralympic champion as well in swimming.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. So thanks, Kurt. So we... I guess I'd have to say I liked working with people, so I went into teaching, and I was always very keen on the environment and how people interacted with it. And I guess I've been doing a lot of monitoring of the waterways and air and so on and so forth. And I realised that I could keep on monitoring a lot, but I needed to change mindsets of people about how they interacted with the environment to try and find a better way forward. So the farm that we developed came out of a wee bit of that, and it also came out of an understanding, something that Sue has already talked about really, which was, you know, if you're in a traditional classroom, how can you engage learners in taking charge of their learning and getting involved more and exploring more and developing deeper understanding. So the farm was developed from there, and we are doing lots on the farm in terms of inquiry learning and activities that students can physically get engaged with and apply understanding in different areas of, for example, of the sciences. And I've just got a few slides now. I thought I'd just show people so they can get just a general appreciation of some of the activities that are happening here. And if you just bear with me, I'll see if I can share that screen.
It's at the bottom under the green button. There you go.
Okay, I'll just show you this. The picture you're seeing of 4 people there on the screen in front of you. The guy on the far left is the head of mathematics, and he's also a qualified engineer. And he's been in charge of directing our students with all of their building projects, of which we've done lots. And the one behind that you can see there is a berry house that's going in, because we're in competition with the birds for all of our berries, and we have to find a way of protecting them. So they've designed this, and they had to go through the measuring and the welding and the drilling and all of the things that are required to set it up. And it's a bigger team than just these 3 young lads that you see here doing the job. They're certainly involved, and they were leaders, but the team is something like 60 strong and rotates on a Tuesday afternoon over 2 hours to deliver these projects. And the one just beneath it is a chicken coop. That's something that the other students have done. But I think you can see the close working relationship there between the boys and also between the teacher and the boys, all in a professional way, but really deep relationships are built there, and that emotional affection in terms of the learning and getting involved in the learning also builds that self-worth and respect for one another. So just some other things, we've got beehives on the farm, and we have visiting schools coming in. The picture you can see just on the left is 2 little kiddies from primary schools that came up, had problems with their self-confidence, and put on these bee suits and went to the hives and and administered, maintain them. And we take the honey away and we separate it and sell the honey. You can just see on the right-hand side in the bottom frame, there's a honey product, of which last year we harvested 16 kilograms. So we're pretty happy with that. Business is also something we try and tie in with. This is our the YES scheme is what's called the Young Enterprise Scheme in New Zealand, and it's run in conjunction with schools and the business community. And we won a national award. In fact, we did it 2 years straight, but this team was working on developing a little biogas digester. That's the thing that you can see on the right-hand side there, and they were collecting food scraps from local supermarkets, macerating them and producing some biogas. So a really good connection to the farm in terms of sustainability as well. Technology of different kinds we try and integrate into the learning that we're doing. You can see in the top left-hand side there a picture of a man from our Otago Polytechnic with a theodolite teaching some kids who are only about 11 years of age how to work out angles for a slope that's just to the right of the picture. We also do soil analysis. The little thing at the bottom that looks like a Star Wars ray gun is in fact a ray gun. It's an X-ray gun, but we don't let the students use it for obvious reasons. But they're measuring the different elements in the soil with that thing, and we can plot a GIS map to see what's in the soil, and that's important for where we put crops and so on. And the picture on the right is the work in series and parallel circuits using solar panels, and this was done to start to work towards powering up a water pump to give us water from a local stream. So we've got animals as well there, and they're very good for kids in terms of just engagement, but also emotional balance, I think, in their lives. And we really find that's a key input into getting a pathway to learning for some of the children. Also, the students, we've got quite a few students you can see just on the left. They're international students at our school. So before the COVID situation, we might have had around about 40 of them from different countries. And we go out and visit a farm where the students are underneath a farm shed there looking at something being demonstrated to them. But some of those students have gone on to have careers in agriculture and as part of their work with us. Just another little picture just up the top right-hand side there. There's a young girl. This is from a primary school. These kids are only 10 years of age, and she's using a little climate monitoring device. And another child just behind her is putting the data into a GIS map in real time using a collector app. So a nice little application of science on the farm. The kids were deciding what the problem was, where are the best sites on the farm to house our animals in terms of temperature or wind chill or light, etc. And just in the last picture there, we've got some special needs students working with me. We have a special needs unit in our school, and we're really pleased to have that. And we're looking at testing the sugar content of fruit to test whether it's ripe or not on the farm using a refractometer. This uses the bending of light to be able to measure whether the juice is ready and just right to pick. So just a couple more. We try and engage with the community. This is dyeing using different plant materials. We ran a workshop with the community just to try and dye different patterns on clothes, which was a success using sort of a steam process. We've been doing some fencing and worked with a contractor from a rural institute to deliver that. And you can see there, that's almost a dead straight line. And if you're fencing, that's what you want when you line up all of your post people. So I can tell you that that's a young man's game. I dug one post hole myself. That's enough for me, but it was great to have so many students around to dig the holes. And that's just the last picture here is a picture of the team that put that fence together. It's a 30 by 30 metre fence. We really focused on using sustainable materials wherever we could. So we didn't use, for example, tannalized posts. These are chrome copper arsenate posts. We're trying to show on our farm how things can be done differently. So we use what's called macrocarpa post, a semi-hardwood, and other materials. But if you have a look at the picture there, you can see an instructor on the far right in his orange shirt. And you can see the kids who have worked together there to deliver over 3 days really worked well and fully engaged with what they've done. So just a student right in the middle in there with a spade from China. Zoe, she's been with us and really enjoyed this activity. So it's another very good connection for international students to connect to part of New Zealand life. So I think I'll end it there, Kurt, and I can certainly answer some questions from others.
You are definitely humble because you had indicated you couldn't do a post hole, but you have a PhD that stands for post hole digger, you know. Chris has a question. So Chris.
Well, one of our goals on Silver Lining for Learning is to take people who may be watching the show either live or in the archives, and they see something that they're excited and they think, gee, I'd like to do something like that in my region of the world with my students. I'm wondering if how practical it is for many teachers to do the types of things that you're doing. I can imagine a teacher looking at this saying, wow, I wish I had their budget and I would then be able to do authentic project-based science too. So what advice would you have for teachers who do have access to land, because obviously that's important, or at least some facilities for growing things, but who may have a very limited budget and not necessarily a welcoming school in terms of this kind of approach?
Chris, would you like me to answer that, or Sue?
Both of you.
All right, Sue, I'll go first. Just from our perspective, I agree with you, Chris. You know, one of the things for me is because our school had so much land, I could see that we weren't using it and we could share it. And my whole model is to be sharing what we're doing with other schools. And so we get other schools coming towards us for programs as well. And what I say to them is that then learn things with us here, but then go back to your own school and look at your own site and decide what could you do here easily that would be an application that you've learned from your learning with us. So I think that sharing is just vital in education, and we're doing it ourselves there, but we need to do a lot more. Can I just say something too about the sharing, not just with schools, but also across what I call the grey zones of education. You've got the transitions between primary and secondary, but secondary to tertiary is also really important. So last year, for example, I had College of Education students with me learning environmental science, and we used the farm as one of the contexts for their learning. But it's a win-win partnership is what we need to focus on, is how different people that come to us, what will be the win for them when they come to us, and what will be the win for us when they come to us. And that's really important to try and focus on. So I hope I've answered your question.
Chris, in answer to your question, I come from I came from a school that was very much an urban school. The land is, of course, very limited. And when you sort of consider the question that you said, it's very true. If you don't have the support of the management and you don't have the resources, how are you going to manage it? And this is where it's very important for a teacher to extend out to the community. For example, there are community gardens around the school. And if a teacher is interested, the teacher could do a one-off trip to a community garden, bring the information back, and actually set up what are called micro gardens inside the classroom. So it all depends on how much time you can invest, apart from the amount of money that you can invest. Quite often, if a teacher approaches a big organization, for example, being a low decile school where my school couldn't really afford to spend a lot of money for plants, and we do know that even a small little pot, you would get nothing less than $3. So if I wanted something like even 20 of them, it would cost money. It was more of a question of ringing around, using a begging bowl, telling them the school that I was from, and if I could get help. And quite often knocking doors could help in providing with what you need. Now, again, it depends on how you go about it, because you have to convince the person at your school what the kids are going to get out of it. Because it's not just something of a show and kind of a thing that comes up there and it's, flash in the pan, happens today, gone tomorrow. And apart from this, because this is one of the ideas I guess we are floating, but there are so many ideas that one can carry out within the school itself with project-based learning that may yield a product, may not yield a product, but at least there is real learning happening during that time where the project is running in the school.
So I have a question, actually two, which is really a follow-up to Chris, because I know the New Zealand national curriculum is quite more open than many other countries. I know your government, your previous education minister or ministers try to make it more stringent. And you also don't really have national standardized testing. So so those are really different ways of assessment. So New Zealand seems to have a broader understanding of education, which I want to say congratulations. And the two of you have done something that's still quite exceptional. So I was wondering, in your school, how do you get the school to allow you to do this? Because, again, what you do is not traditionally the same as most teachers, right? You do this. So that's really the first question. How do you get your schools to support what you do? And second of all, are your colleagues, are the other teachers doing similar things? Or do you feel you are still quite exceptional in your own school? And Sue and Simon, I would love to have answers from both of you. Thank you.
I think I'll take that question, Yong, because currently I'm no longer in the classroom. I work for the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. So I'm a national assessment facilitator, and we are actually looking at making our examinations very different to what is happening around the world currently. And we've already stepped into that area where we're not too sure where we're going, but we're making a huge attempt to bring in UDL and do away with, I'm not saying do away with, alongside traditional 2 hours or 3 hours examination slots, we are now changing the face of assessments, making it more accessible to all students. And there is a huge move towards UDL, the Universal Design for Learning, where we're looking at not just teaching with variety, but expecting representation with variety and submission with variety. So that's one of the things about the national exams, where even at the national level, we are moving towards innovative assessments. Coming to the second part, it is indeed very difficult if you are up against people who do not want you to carry out innovative things. But in most schools, if they have let you go on a 6 months Fulbright Award or a Science Teacher Leadership Award that I have had in the past, or a year away on a Royal Society Fellowship Award, the school's question is, why are we letting you go? This is investment. We require you to come back and do something. And as you very rightly said, there are a large number of teachers around you who do not want to necessarily engage in similar activities because it's time investment. But the best way things happen is usually through the students themselves. Because when you're teaching chemistry, doing candle making in the classroom, and the kids are not using a notebook to write pages and pages and pages of notes from a PowerPoint or death by PowerPoint, quite often the word gets around, and quite often you'll have the kids questioning their teachers as to why we can't do the fun things that are happening in another class. So when you do these kind of things, you share the ideas, but that again happens at the professional development stage. And if you have one or two colleagues who you can bring in or rope in, and then you present the material to your other colleagues, you have step-by-step method of what you're doing. You tell them where you can get it, what you can do, and everything is provided for. There is quite a lot of buy-in over a period of time. It doesn't happen instantly. Have I been faced with it? Yes, I have. Have I been successful? To a very large extent, yes. And word by mouth through students makes a lot of difference. And trying to do it as a department takes quite a bit of time. But by and large, most schools in New Zealand have very encouraging senior management who will buy your ideas if it means engaging students and students liking what they are doing and learning actually by doing.
Yeah, well done, Sue. I think a couple of things from my perspective. I think one thing you absolutely have to have is a leader in the school who pushes something like what I've done here over a long period of time. What's also important is that, if you don't mind me saying so, not that I think of myself this way, but if you've got some standing, if you have been in the community working and people know you and you build sincerity with them in the community, and that helps you to make changes in the school too. The other thing for teachers is you need to build what you're doing into the curriculum, embed it not just as an extra. It's got to be in the curriculum, and you've got to show staff and you've got to show your management how it works. For example, we've had staff meetings where they're required to come across to the farm and do activities that show them how students would benefit from being involved there, and how they as teachers would benefit from being there too. So I think that's really important, is having leadership that endures, not necessarily just in the school leadership or senior management, but in the person driving the project over a long period of time. And you've got to have your view of the medium to long term, not just the short term, to be able to keep going and realize that the project you're doing has value. There are plenty of barriers there, aren't there, to opportunity, but I've always looked at life in this way, and maybe that comes a wee bit from the disability side of my life earlier, is that there are many barriers, but in every barrier that someone doesn't want to touch, there's an opportunity for someone else, and you just have to find your way around the barrier. And for me, that's really part of life, of doing that, and I think it's manifested itself in this project with the desire, if you like, and the persistence and perseverance to keep it going and get to the end where we have success.
So I want to ask kind of the opposite question, if you will, in a way. Instead of thinking about the limitations or the challenges to overcome, I want to do a what if with both of you and ask, and this has happened to me, by the way, so it's not totally out of the blue, but it wasn't for this dollar amount. What if some organization in New Zealand came to you and said, we have $1 million for STEM related activities, grants, projects, and so forth. We just need you to write up. What would be your idea that you would put in such a thing? What have you always been wanting to do that you haven't yet been able to do because the dollar's been too high? And in particular, you both have mentioned technologies that you've used. What kind of technologies is the science field about to enter into, or do you think it would benefit from using? Or what are some of the technologies that you haven't been able to afford yet in your projects? And so what would be activities or the project or the theme, and what might be some of the resources that you would want to put into such a grant proposal?
Kurt, for me, it would definitely be drone technology, because there are so many things that our students would learn with just the basics of drone technology. One of the biggest issues I had within my school area was even if I tried doing it, we were very close to the airport, as a result of which getting permission even to fly drones would have been a biggest issue. And you can't really do it within the school hall, even if you want to be able to make sure that you can do the tracking, etc., with landmarks and things like that. So if something like that came about and you had to transport students away from school, particular area, landmarks, how you would be able to do photography, etc., and then convert all that into photogrammetry, I think, again, I really am not a technical buff, but the whole idea of being able to do something to that extent and then connecting it to things like targeted pests in large areas, crops where you were going to be doing, targeted pesticides, or using something, where it was all targeted. And I think this would be something which would be very, very interesting, because all kids are not mathematically great in terms of photogrammetry. But if you had this whole project, you see each kid would have their own niche areas. And that's where you would have huge amount of collaboration, right from someone being fantastic with flying a drone to somebody else mathematically being able to plot points and do photogrammetry, to someone else actually designing what area we're going to do, what are our landscapes, what exactly is the whole project about, what exactly are we aiming at. And so this is something that I have, had I continued with teaching, this would have been my next project. I knew it was a lot of money, but this would have been the project which I would have actually gone ahead and tried out with other, companies, etc., and using the kids as a collaborative group. So that would be something I would love to do.
Simon.
Well, I guess I one of the things I'd like to do is, because you keep pushing with the project to get it finished, to keep it going and going, I'd like some time just to sit down and write the pedagogy in a coherent program in a document somewhere that would be able to be shared and transferred to others to see what we're doing. But apart from that, the technology side of things, the GIS that we've done has been really good and engaging for kids. They've really liked it, and the whole idea of a smartphone where you're punching in the data, and as soon as you punch it in a few moments, it's going to a live map, and you can see the data coming in from kids, and you can see whether they've got a data point in the middle of a road, which is not where they're supposed to be, for example. All sorts of things like that are just really neat to use. We have things, applications of physics are also really good, like magnetometers and ground penetrating radar, where you can see underneath the Earth's surface, and you can then get kids to map, for example, the local geology underneath our area. And it's all doable, but it's definitely a funding situation. So I think those areas are just exciting for kids in terms of engagement and learning. And it's really good to bring the physicists out of their great field into the applied area for kids, so that they can see that directly, what the applications of physics are.
What's the title for your project that you haven't done yet?
Well, I've just been sort of mulling around with a few things, Kurt, I'd have to say, but it's I haven't got it in a nutshell yet.
We'll talk later. Chris has a question for you.
Yes, my doctorate half a century ago was in science education, and although I work more in learning technologies now through the lens of science, I've seen many generations of science education, and I've seen the cycles, where we do project-based for a while, and then people say, well, that's not efficient, we can just tell the kids everything, and then we figure out that didn't work very well, and we do project-based for a while. I mean, there is a kind of sense of the more things change, the more they stay the same. But really a challenge that's, I think, bigger than any that I've seen in my half century in science education is with us now, and that's this issue of climate change. Climate change is controversial, and the way that teaching evolution is controversial. Climate change is something that this next generation is inheriting, that's going to have, huge impacts on them. And climate change is not easy to understand from a scientific perspective. It's seemingly very slow until it's very fast. It's seemingly, not a big deal, and then suddenly it's a really big deal. It's interdisciplinary, so it doesn't fit well into curriculum standards, at least not in the US. And I know that what you've described relates to science, to climate change, can be positioned in terms of climate change. But I just appreciate your thoughts, what you would say to other science educators about how you think the field should approach climate change, and how you think individual teachers might approach it if the field is a little too slow in terms of its response.
Well, I just thought maybe I'll have a go, Sue, first. I think, thanks, Chris, for the question. I think in the project that I'm dealing with, the growing of food locally is a key point of one of the aspects of the farm. So, for example, that means less transport required if we are really good at producing food, and we're getting better and better as the farm gets older and our systems get better. So that's one aspect of trying to deal to that, the whole climate change issue that we're trying to do. But I think one of the things I've found, and it actually relates to a wider field of earth science, is that it's still in New Zealand schools a bit of a poor cousin to the other big three in the biological world, physical world, and chemical world. And I think Sue sort of alluded to it with assessment, but also with our new curriculum coming in, there's going to be a wider scope to look at integrating cross-curricular type projects that are going to be more beneficial, which bring in the social ideas, sustainability, for example, and also the science ideas, communication ideas, all into a nutshell that'll be useful for us to try and deal with climate change. But I still think kids have a low appreciation of how climate change affects them. And I think giving time within the curriculum is just vital. So ensuring that that's there, and you're not in a competition with other subjects for other hours in school, that you have a chance to deliver that. So I'd like to see it as some more standalone hours for climate change / earth science systems in New Zealand schools.
Following on from Simon, with the new way we're going with our assessments, there is a huge push in various subjects to make sure that there is some kind of an integration between ideas. And climate change is something that is coming through in practically all the areas. Now, I think earlier it was kind of siloed. So it's, the geographers will teach this, the biologists will teach this, as a result of which they were kind of very much standalone areas. But we're noticing a couple of big things. We're noticing that our youngsters, thanks to social media, are far, far more proactive about this whole idea of what they are inheriting. We're going to go, we'll be gone, but it's their world that they will be inheriting. And I think this consciousness among youngsters is far more. And so the buy-in is going to be far more with our youngsters. And this whole idea of within the curriculum, Chris, I think it's very important that we actually have a separate subject area on climate change, even though it may be in bits and bobs in the various other subjects. Now, for example, if we look at food and nutrition at the moment, our ideas are going much beyond just learning about food literacy. We're now going into further understanding the social justice principles. And that's where, as Simon said, about locally growing our food, because a large amount of it is carbon footprint. The amount of food that comes in as export from various parts of the world, the transportation of the food, and the amount of damage that we're causing to the environment is enormous. But this is an idea, again, where the social justice principles play a very important role, because you're going to have a large group of people saying, I can afford it, I don't care. Whereas it's going to be a large group that are going to say, look at the effects. And so to bring about that mindset requires it to be discussed, to be talked about, to be understood within the principles of the curriculum. And I'm hoping that we are going that way, because there is a lot of change happening within our ways of teaching and learning at the moment, that is going to be rolled out in the next 3 years consecutively, and then becoming a part of the program in New Zealand.
Chris, I'm going to go in a different direction, so I make sure. Do you have a follow-up question or comment before I ask a? No. And I want to point out to the audience's questions, their emails are in the blog post for this week. So if something caught your fancy and you want to write to Simon or Sue, definitely send them an email, and they will respond quickly. I found that out. Before I ask my question that I have, I want to get a clarification, because this is almost 2 years since we started our show, and we started 2 years ago, the day after tomorrow, and we started because of COVID. And I know the response in New Zealand was totally unique in the world. And how has there been anything unique within the schools and how you've handled COVID in the New Zealand schools, or anything you would like to just mention before I ask my question?
I haven't been at school, Kurt, but I have been constantly in touch with my principal, Mr. Von Quio, who is probably a leader in what he did with COVID, because our school, Papatoe High, was the first school that had the COVID cases amongst the students. And the way he rapidly got in, was able to contact practically all the parents as quickly as possible, contained it, was just amazing the way he handled it. The kids were segregated. Nobody knew who the kids were, because that was important, because they did not, in the initial stages, we had no idea how the kids may or may not have been targeted when they came back to school. And I think keeping that safety in mind and making sure that nobody in the school except the person's teacher was, because that was the point of contact, was made aware of and sworn to secrecy, was something that I give a huge amount of credit to him for. After it became more and more common, and practically then was, yeah, I got COVID, have you got COVID? Or, with the kids, how it is, it was a different thing altogether. But that initial way, the way it was handled at the school, was very, very well done. And I think most of the other schools have followed in similar paths, but they were on the news constantly every day. And it wasn't easy for a school to handle something like that when you're in the national news day after day.
Well, actually, you were in the international news day after day in New Zealand. We're hearing what happens in New Zealand because it was an isolated case. Simon, is people all come back without masks now in Dunedin, or are they still wearing masks?
Just backing the truck up a wee bit. So we have had a really good run up until now, because I think the country was really pulled together as one, which is what a small country can do. And I think that both political parties guided the country very well in the initial stages of the outbreak, and I thought they did that very well, was my opinion. There's some holes certainly appearing now with a few things, but this is for politicians around the world. This is a huge issue to deal with. And I think we all have to understand that and take that personal responsibility. So we're just getting Omicron outbreak at the moment through schools. So students are required to wear masks at school. At our school, they're very good at wearing them. And yet, we still are running farm activities in the outside. And in fact, it's better out there to run learning activities. You've got the space, we can separate the kids out and still, so that's been very good. I think in my opinion, the messaging from the Ministry of Education to school leaders, to staff, to parents has been excellent. We've had a lot of, in my opinion, efficient transferring of information to know what's the direction we should be going, what are we required to do, etc., etc. Some of it hasn't, always been workable at the end, but then those are the things that happen with a big issue like this. They're just very difficult to manage with lots of people fast. One of the issues we had was distribution of laptops in the very first start of everything to families that didn't have access and so on. So, yeah.
So I want to ask you go in another direction. Simon, when you were studying here at Indiana, with me at Indiana, you were working on or reading a lot about Feuerstein's work in Israel, and really concerned about metacognitive skills of your students and ways in which you can enhance those or get students to meta-reflect on their own skills. But when you presented just now, I just said John Dewey 3 times to myself. It's really, you're relying on Dewey's work in PBL and building farms. Also, David Jonathan, as I mentioned earlier, his constructivism work and his mind tools ideas. Sue or Simon, who theoretically, who are your heroes and why?
Well, we have a lady working for us at NZCER called Rose Hipkins. You may have heard of her. She's published a lot in the literature throughout New Zealand, and she's a really good ambassador for science. And she's been very good with her understandings of helping us on the farm and in terms of our project. And one of the areas that she's identified as a key competency for the future is definitely the whole idea of thinking. But there's a difference between promoting thinking in terms of just having it in programs, but how you implement it with staff, with kids, to meet cognitive challenges that kids have. So the Feuerstein work, this is 40 years ago now, and it has strengths and weaknesses with it, but the core of what's there is just really fascinating to think these guys that long ago had nutted out how to try and meet cognitive dysfunctions in students by developing certain instruments that you could teach as a teacher and know you were dealing to those cognitive dysfunctions of students to improve them. And I found that a very good program to do. It has limitations because if you start to deliver it, you've got to deliver it in a creative way to keep the engagement going with thinking. After all, I think in the book, Kurt, I talk about sometimes thinking as being sort of an underwhelming thing that people all think they do. But in the end, there are lots of tricks there for students and teachers and adults to learn. So I found it very interesting to look at his program. So there are 2 people. There was a couple of guys actually from Denmark. We are also an Enviro school. I don't know whether Sue's school was, but it gets back to Chris's question about climate change too, because there's a program that goes throughout New Zealand in primary schools and also in some secondary schools, although it's less popular there. And I think it's because the curriculum is more crowded there. But Enviro Schools is a program that has very much issues to do with social justice and climate change and environmental action. And a few years ago, we attended a conference, and I forget the guy's name. I think it was Schneck from Denmark, and he introduced that whole idea of action competence to what you were doing. Is that if you're going to act, make sure you know how you're going to act and why it's important to act in that way. And I thought that was a really good marker in the sand for me about the difference between just talking about acting, but actually acting. And that's one of the reasons the urban farm was developed, is to get a change in mindset, get people to act on things to change things, not just talk endlessly about it with program designs, etc., but get them doing the stuff. So 3 people there for me.
So, sounds good. I'll go to Sue, and then Young will have the final question. I'll have a last comment before Chris introduces the next show. Sue.
I'll be very upfront and honest, and that is every time you read about this great person and you read about this person, it doesn't really stay in my head unless it's very interesting. And so what I have admired are random speakers or people who have just sort of, I can't even remember their names, but who sort of have said something or done something. For example, when I was in the States, I remember going to the NSTA conference. I still can't remember who the lady was. She was an ordinary teacher from a school, ordinary person like me, no big name. But to me, she was a big name because the ideas that she had were all very simple. And those were the things that I remember I can actually do this if I modify it. And I came back and I picked up on those ideas and I carried on. Similarly, I've had some wonderful experiences here in New Zealand where this is going back way, way, way back in 2005. I had a whole year away from school on a Royal Society fellowship, and I worked with a whole bunch of scientists who were doing amazing work. Now, I understood what they were doing, but I knew I couldn't do any of that coming back into the classroom. But there was a scientist out there who said to me, would your kids like to come and just see what it's like and get a taster of what a lab work looks like for a research assistant? And bang, that was it. There were 3 students who went there, did some work, came back, and they said, Miss, I know what we're going to be doing when I grow up. Now, that person stood out for me because these were tasters. And in the same way, I've been through a whole lot of people whose names I cannot remember, but they are my heroes because they would have said something, they would have shown me something, I would have come back to the classroom, I would have used those skills, transformed it, done something where a small little thing using different shaped balloons going across a string using a straw can get the whole idea of acceleration in a jiffy compared to somebody who gives you all these big lectures. And the whole class, there are about 30 of them enjoying it or chucking, eggs with different casing from the top of a 3-story building where you sort of see which one is the best packaging. But these are ideas that I've picked up. So when we talk about big people, yeah, Dewey is there and there is the other people. But for me, it's always been very ordinary people who've been my motivators, who've been my real life heroes, because there have been umpteen number of things that I have picked up along the way.
Well, I want to thank my friends here for coming this week. Young's on the. I just want to say thank you very much. Young has the last comment before we go to
well, I would just make a comment and invite you to say a few words. I think Sue, you're absolutely. I really like what you said. Do we or don't we? Who cares, right? I mean, it's really about what matters to you. I'm a person who is horrible with all these big names, just all the different isms, So I appreciate both Simon and Sup what you've done. Well, let's use actually the last 2 minutes. I really would like you to look at yourself as exceptional. Again, as I said, I've been to many, many schools, thousands of schools, probably, but really what you are doing as teachers, you're exceptional. Of course, you went to Bloomington, Indiana, you've studied with Kurt Bunk, and that might be the reason. But really, what would you say, Sue and Simon, to teachers in their traditional classrooms, traditional schools, where they don't have any of the support? How would you encourage them to say, let's get started on this? What would you say? Short, 1 minute.
Passion. It's all to do with passion. And it's not always all the gadgets you have, not always the technology you have, but it just could be stories that motivate the kids, where kids actually see you, ordinary person. I came as an immigrant into this country, couldn't get a job initially for 6 months, and then went on to represent New Zealand as the first Kiwi in America. And those are stories that you tell the kids and you motivate them and tell them, you can do this. You don't teach about acids and bases starting with pH. Tell them about a story where a girl, walking through, wants an education in India, is not allowed it. Why? Because her family doesn't want it, boyfriend doesn't want it, and he smashes her face using just an ordinary little bulb with liquid. Even the most boring kids in the back will say, and I go, but why a bulb? Why couldn't he use something else? And the kid who doesn't have a clue with you will turn around and say, oh, acid is corrosiveness. And you've got them hooked on. And it's all to do with the passion, the motivation, the whole idea of sometimes just a small, short little video. Don't bore them with PowerPoints. Don't bore them with writing. And I'm going to share, if you don't mind, a very, very short story where I met a student of mine after she had passed out of school years later at a medical event. And she said to me, Miss, I need to tell you something. And I said, what? She said, when we were your student, we just thought you didn't really know science. And I said, oh. And she said, don't get annoyed. Listen to the rest of it. And I said, well, why? She said, all the year 9 students had 4 1B5 books. And the 4 1B5 books had notes from the first page till the last page. You were the only teacher who had used 1.5 books. And so we thought you didn't know science because all the time you were excited about doing this hands-on, growing crystals, pulling the plant's leaves off and measuring them. And you sort of realize students have this idea that writing is equal to science. It's not. And yet these were kids who retained far more because they had used their hands with very small, simple things in the classroom. So it's passion for me.
Thank you. Simon, 15 seconds.
I think that you really have to rise above it all. You have to look at the so-called dross of education, leave it behind, and be that creative person that you know is going to be effective for your students.
Thank you. Chris, go ahead, introduce next episode.
Next week is episode 99. And we have 2 experts whose work I have known and admired since the 1980s, Jeremy Verschell and Barbara Means from Digital Promise. And the episode is about mechanisms for achieving educational visions. We have no shortage of visions. We do have a shortage of how to get there.